Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about native bees in Manitoba and pollinator habitat for native bee conservation. I know everyone here is pretty familiar with bees generally, but you might find a few things surprising in this talk. This is an image from a recent paper that just came out this past year. Each one of these little circles represents a different scientific study that looked at flower visitors in different parts of the world. And the orange part of the pie chart is honeybees, and the green part is honeybees. So it's pretty clear that in some parts of the world, maybe down here in sort of the almond sort of growing industry of California, honeybees are dominant. But in large parts of the world, there's other insects that are out there pollinating plants. This slide is just to show you give you a sense of the diversity of bees generally. Each one of these bars represents the number of species in each one of these groups. So mammals, birds, reptiles, all bees, as was stated, with 20,000 species described. And then honeybees are this invisible little line down here. There's only about 9 species globally. So there's a lot of different species of bees, and most of them are nothing like a honeybee. So this is a little bee. This is a little sweat bee in the genus Lasya Blossom. These are the bees that I like to study. And most bees don't sting very readily. It's pretty hard to get stung by a native bee. Most of them are solitary. It's just a single female building a nest and provisioning for her offspring. A typical bee nest is actually an underground burrow. They dig into the ground. Very few of them are black or yellow. That's not really for honeybee people, but they don't make honey. And most of them, we don't know enough about them to really get a sense of their conservation status. It's hard to know if native bees are declining because very few people have ever studied them in enough detail historically. This is an image of what we sometimes call a bee hotel. This is, each one of these little holes is a potential bee nest. They like to nest in wood, in straws, stems, anywhere they can get a little entrance, a little hole. And there's hundreds of bee nests in this little this little bee hotel. But they're so unlikely to sting that you can have some stranger's kids and you can sort of point them out and you don't have to worry about anyone getting stung. So they're pretty gentle as a rule. This is one of the native bees that was in that bee hotel. This is Osmia lignaria. It's called a mason bee. And this is what the inside of a mason bee's nest looks like. So it collects mud to partition its cells. And then these are individual cocoons of its offspring. And this is a little bit of pollen for a cell that never got finished. This is a leafcutter bee nest below it. And so that female actually cuts pieces of leaves, brings those back to the nest, makes these little cylinders, and then stuffs pollen and nectar inside for each one of her offspring. And then this is actually a solitary wasp nest down here. And wasps behave very similarly to these native bees, except they just collect insects instead of pollen. But most bees actually nest in the ground. So about 70% of nesting bees nest in underground burrows. This is a solitary female laden with pollen. She's digging her way down into her nest. Most of these nests are actually pretty obscure. So this is one of our native solitary bees, Andrina barbarolaris. She's got a pollen load. She's coming back to her nest. She lands on this sort of bare patch of soil, and then she finds her nest down here by this little piece of grass. And then when she's in there, you would never know that nest was there. They're very obscure. So there's bees nesting everywhere, and most people just don't notice. You can look pretty hard for this, and unless you see a female coming back, you'll miss it. The inside of a bee nest, native bee nest, is a little bit different from a honeybee. So they mass provision their offspring, so they just collect pollen and nectar, make it form a ball, lay an egg on it, and then they close that cell and they never interact with that offspring again. So this is a sweat bee cell, sort of smoothed out of the substrate. They have glandular secretions and they sort of pat it down nice and smooth, and that's the egg. And then this is a leafcutter bee nest when I peeled off all the leaf pieces, there was about 30 or so leaf pieces just to construct a single cell, and then that's the egg. And that's all the food they'll get until they're adults. And this is sort of the basic sort of steps. So the egg hatches into larva, she feeds on that ball, and then when she's developed, she pupates, and then she'll turn into this. This is a native bee. This is an Wildflower pura. It's a solitary bee nested in rotten logs. These are just a selection of different kinds of bees that we have in Manitoba, and most of them have very different life history traits from one another. Most of them are solitary, but they live their lives in slightly different ways. Sweat bees are pretty diverse in terms of their social behavior, so some of them are solitary, but some of them also have these social colonies, kind of like a bumblebee with these sort of annual sort of cycles where there's a single female builds a nest, and then all of her initial offspring are females, and they become workers, and then it becomes a sort of social colony. And then there's leafcutter bees, which I've mentioned. Woolcutter bees are closely related to leafcutter bees, except instead of collecting leaf pieces, they collect plant hairs. They scrape the trichomes off leaves and make this sort of woolly sort of nest. This little bee, which kind of looks kind of wasp-like, it's not very hairy, it's because it actually carries all of its pollen back to its nest internally in its crop. These are minor bees. These are your fairly typical solitary ground nesting bee. This is a cuckoo bee. This bee actually doesn't build a nest or collect pollen at all. She just goes into the nests of other bees and lays her eggs. About 17% of all bees are cuckoo bees. This is a mason bee, which I mentioned. This is a resin bee, and these actually collect plant resins to build their nests. This bee was only recently recorded from Manitoba. 2 species are in this group that we found, and that hasn't yet been published. Flower bees is sometimes a name for another group, another solitary ground nesting group of bees. Little carpenter bees, which nest in stems, so old grass stems, raspberry canes, anything like that. Longhorn bees, which are sort of summer flying species. The males have these incredibly long antennae. Squash bees, which are species that only visit cucurbits, so pumpkins, squash, cucumbers, things like that. Some of these green metallic sweat bees. These bees are called cellophane bees. They're also solitary. Some of them are plant specialists. They only visit a certain species of flower. And they actually line their nests with this glandular secretion, which hardens into this cellophane-like material. It's sort of transparent. And so their nests, their provisions are actually fairly liquid, and sometimes the larvae actually develop these sort of lobes on the sides, so they sort of float on top. Then we also have this oil-collecting bee, and she actually feeds oils to her offspring from this special plant, so she only visits this one plant called yellow loosestrife, Lysomachia, which you sort of find in wet areas. And then these are 3 different kinds of cuckoo bees that specialize on different kinds of bee species. And then there's the bumblebees, which most people are sort of familiar with, but there's a whole slew of different kinds of species that we have as well. And some of the bumblebee species, like this one, Bombus citrinus, and this one, Bombus insularis, are actually social parasites. So they invade the nests of other bee colonies and take over the role of being queen. This is a close-up of one of the leafcutter cuckoo bees. So she lays her eggs in leafcutter bee nests. And they have sort of a special sort of larval development, which is kind of interesting. So the leafcutter bee, she builds her cell, she fills it with pollen and nectar, she lays her egg. The cuckoo bee comes in and lays her egg in the same cell. And then when the second instar larva develops, it grows these enormously long mandibles, which it uses to actually kill the host bee larva. And then when it then molts into a third instar larva, the mandibles go back to normal, and then it feeds. So it's kind of not quite as peaceful as you might imagine some bees. And then this is sort of a special kind of group of bees from the neotropics. There's 3 species of stingless honeybees which have sort of gone backwards, and they actually consume dead and rotting meat. So you probably wouldn't want to sell the honey that these bees are making. Bees also like to, even the ones around here, like to take advantage of other sort of secretions. This is a sweat bee. They get their name honestly. They actually drink sweat. They'll also go after tears, and some other bees will go after either human tears or turtles or crocodiles or whatever. So they get some sort of nutrients, salts, things from these sorts of things. So these are a little bit weird. So probably most of you have are sort of familiar with this sort of idea. You know, if the bees go, then we're all in trouble. But for native bees, it's a little more complicated question because there's so many different species. This is a study that came out looking at historical trends of wild bees based on museum records going back from 1872 up to 2011, around the time the data collection was finished. And actually what was found was that the number of exotic species in North America was actually increasing. This was in the northeastern part of mostly in the United States. We keep getting these introductions of new species, mostly these species that nest in cavities. The number of bumblebee species was, or the relative abundance of bumblebee species was significantly declining. So there's certain species of bumblebees that have dramatically declined over time. But when we looked at all the other native species, although there was a bit of a downward trend, it wasn't statistically significant. So there wasn't a clear pattern for all the native species. And part of this is because so many of these species have different sort of life histories and different behaviors that they actually respond differently. So in this graph, we have different groups of bees, different genera of bees, and this dotted line along the middle of the graph is the rate of change over time, so over that 100-year period. So 0 means that they were stable over that time period. So some bees do poorly, so they actually go into the negatives, and some bees actually do quite well. So my sweat bees actually are fairly sort of stable in this environment. They actually like to live in disturbed areas, and so you can go to a cornfield and find sweat bees. But other bees like bumblebees and some of the leafcutter bees don't do so well. And this has to do with some of their different life history traits. So how narrow their diet breadth is, how long they fly, how big they are. So how do we support native bees? So it's pretty similar to how we support honeybees. We try to give them nutritious resources, try to give them a safe place to live, and we try not to kill them. But I'm going to mostly talk about this in the context of habitat. So one of the things that I've been involved in was trying to encourage people to sort of plant native flowers. So the idea being you plant species that are going to bloom over an extended period of time, so that there's going to be resources from early spring all the way into the fall. So some of your willows, things like penstemon, this is golden alexander, some of your early blooming trees, then some early summer blooming flowers, later sort of summer flowers, and then lots of asters and goldenrods and things in the fall. This is what we're trying to encourage landowners to actually plant in their property, both sort of urban sort of people, but then also I'll talk a little bit about farmers as well. So we try to encourage people that even a small patch of habitat is better than no habitat at all. So this is, you can just have something in your backyard. Anything is better than this, right? This is not something that we want. This sort of dense sort of patch of grass not only doesn't have any flowers, but actually doesn't have anything anywhere for bees to find a good nesting habitat. This picture here is sort of a fallow field with a path that had been sort of cut in, mowed through. And this is actually a dense nesting aggregation of solitary bees was found here. There's leafcutter bees all throughout this patch. You never notice, but there's lots of bees there. And so we're trying to encourage people who sort of own sort of property to have gardens that look like this, something where you can have your little patch of grass if you want to kick around a soccer ball or something, but then have these big patches of flowers where people, where you'll support bees in your small little patch of land. Or even sort of things like this. This is what we call a bee spiral. It's designed to sort of look semi-attractive, but it has this sort of patches of bare grounds which you can plant herbs, and then native bees will actually be able to nest there. Right? So you can have a little nesting aggregation on your own property for a small patch of land. When we're talking to growers, we're trying to encourage them to put in larger patches of flowers. So this is a blueberry field shown here in the background. And then this is a I want to say 2 acres of native flowering habitat that was planted just a little bit upland. It wasn't good blueberry habitat, so they were just mowing it every year. That was their sort of thing. So we just said, plant it up in wildflowers, and then you never have to touch it. So this is sort of what it looks like from a different angle at a different time of year. There's your blueberries, some space for your tractor to turn around, and then you just have this patch of flowers that's supporting bees throughout the year. And so when you just look a little bit of a close-up, you have all these different plant species, a variety of plants for a variety of bees. And some colleagues working on these sorts of properties did some studies, and looking over time, so over a 4-year period, so it looks a little smushed. And they were comparing it to a sort of a grassy sort of border, sort of a typical sort of situation. And they found that over time, the number of wild bees that were being shown, that were seen visiting the blueberry flowers increased over time. It takes a while, because the bees have to find that habitat, they have to establish, they have to build up their populations, but within about a 3 or 4 year period, you have more bees visiting your flowers. And then if you're actually interested in the economics as a grower, you actually get increased yield from all these visits. And so the percent of yield increases over time, and so your profit, there's a bit of a lag because it actually costs you to put those wildflowers in, but then after that 4-year period, you've made all your money back. And so in the United States, where this work was done, there's also a lot of government sort of subsidies for putting in this sort of habitat. So the government will pay 90% of the upfront costs, and so you make your money back almost immediately. But it's actually a lot of work putting in these habitats. These 2 are plants that we tried to establish with the exact same seed mix. These were both in southern Michigan, similar habitats, very similar results. So it's actually something that has to be done with a certain amount of care and a certain amount of preparation. This is still not terrible for some bees. This is actually just red clover, but all those native plants didn't establish. And so one of the things I sometimes mention to people that bees, how far bees fly really is dependent on their size. Honeybees fly really far. And for other bees, it's basically, you measure the size of their thorax, and that gives you an indication of how far they're likely to fly. So some bees, my small little sweat bees, might only forage 100 to 200 meters in their life. That's sort of their range. And then bumblebees will fly a couple of kilometers. But if you have a 3-kilometer radius, you can cover almost 7,000 acres. So in sort of an urban setting, this is sort of a bee that's nesting down here, can potentially visit this entire habitat, right? And so we're trying to encourage people in sort of urban settings that anything that you can provide is going to provide access to those bees. If people are interested in sort of additional resources, the Xerces Society puts out a lot of interesting books for attracting native pollinators, farming with beneficial insects, managing with alternative pollinators. These are resources to help farmers and growers make habitats that are better not just for wild bees, but for all bees. There's some general books about how to recognize native pollinators. These are some other extensions. I used to work at Michigan State University, which is why these are all here. But different ways of sort of enhancing habitat for bees. And then this is sort of a recent one that came out, sort of how to establish those wildflower plantings on farms to increase the likelihood of success. And that's it. I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has them. Yeah.
Those bee hotels, so they sell that now in places like Costco. We were talking about this last night. Is that really as simple as just set it up and they will move in?
Yeah, it's kind of a, what was it, if you build it, they'll come kind of situation. Yeah, some of the ones that I see for sale, I wouldn't necessarily use. You want to have, if it's something about 6 to 8 inches deep, you're doing pretty well. But sometimes you'll see some of the ones for sale, they're only this 3 or 4 inches long. It's not a very attractive site for a bee. But it doesn't have to be complicated, right? So you can take a block of wood, drill with a long drill bit, make some holes. I saw some invasive Phragmites reeds and some ditches driving yesterday. Let's take those, cut them up, make a little bundle, hang it in the tree. Bees will nest there. Bamboo, cut bamboo, and those the nodes act as pretty effective sort of barriers on the backside. So you can make it as simple or as complex as you want.
I have a question about soil. You mentioned the burrowing bees and setting up the little, I forget what you call it, the little spiral thingy.
Sure.
I'm sure you know the soil we have around here. It's more like cement than anything else. Is that much of a consideration for these bees? If we're going to construct something, is it better for us to maybe try and put in something that's a little more loose?
Yeah, most people who sort of looked at it, bees like a fairly high concentration of sand, silt kind of in their nests. It's just easier to dig, so clay tends to not be as good as. So if you're going to make something like that bee spiral, I'll just get a good mix of sand into there.
You observed, sir, that while many populations of smaller bees are growing, bumblebees that are bigger and that are native are going downhill.
Right.
Do you want to speak about that a little bit? How is it that happens, and how do we enhance bumblebee populations?
Yeah, the bumblebee story is a bit complicated. So one reason why being bigger is potentially worse is that you need more resources to survive. So if you are a little sweat bee, a few flowers is going to be enough to provide for your offspring. If you're a bumblebee, you need a lot more flowers. That's one part. So that's a sort of a habitat sort of maintenance sort of issue. The other sort of complicating issue with bumblebees is there's sort of two competing sort of areas of thought. One is that it's insecticides and neonicotinoids have sort of caused harm to bumblebees, and the other side is that it's a pathogen. So it's something that was brought in from somewhere else. Sort of two sort of events sort of happened at the same time. Neonicotinoids sort of increased a lot in the 90s, but then also during the 90s, people took bumblebees from North America, brought them over to Europe to learn how to rear them because they've been rearing bumblebees in Europe, and then they brought them back. And then 5 years, after that happened, bumblebee population started to crash. And the ones that have been hit the most severely are all very closely related. So they're not just in the same genus of bumblebee, but they're in the same sort of subgenus, the same subcategory. And so there's something going on, and they've also been declined in areas that aren't particularly farmed heavily. So they were lost in sort of farmlands, and they were lost also in sort of natural habitats. And so the pesticide issue doesn't seem to fit quite well. So it might be a disease that sort of came through. So that's kind of hard for us to sort of do anything about. But the best thing that we can do is basically make habitats more conducive for the bees, because people have shown that if you actually the bees have better nutrition, then they're better able to sort of stave off those sorts of pathogens and diseases.
Thank you.
Sure.
Could you talk a little bit about in your opinion, on the competition between honeybees and the native bees?
Yeah, sure. I have two sides. So I'm a native bee biologist, but my father's also a beekeeper in Ontario. So I'm sort of, so some people who are in sort of my native bee camp look at honeybees as sort of an invasive species from an ecological standpoint. But the other side of it is the way that we farm, if you had a canola field the size of, the way we have canola, if you relied on wild bees, it wouldn't get pollinated. I mean, it's from a sort of a food growing, food security sort of economic sort of standpoint, honeybees are necessary. But that's sort of in terms of competition between them directly, if you have a lot of honeybees in an area, they're taking a lot of pollen and resources out of that area. So it's probably not great for the native bees. But, yeah.
just to follow on that, is there any virus or anything transferable between the honeybees and the native species out there?
Yeah, people have shown that some of these viruses get sort of sort of transmitted through flowers, and so you can pick them up and see them in other bees. It's not a little outside of my line of research, but just the fact that you can find a virus doesn't mean that it's going to cause physical harm. Right? So I'm sure I could find honeybee viruses on everyone in this room, but you're not suffering for it. So it's a little hard to